And I'd like to now welcome our final speaker for this session, Nick Gay. Nick and his wife Pen run Hluan Pastoral Company near Cowra in New South Wales. So welcome, Nick, and look forward to hearing about your presentation on breeding to meet client needs and how that's applied commercially on farm.
Thank you. So firstly, you'd just like to say a quick thank you to Keely, Peter and Sarah for helping get me here. It's been like herding cats, so thank you very much for that. I'll get straight into it. So my wife, our three boys and I run a farm in the Southwest Slopes region of New South Wales, supported by fantastic staff, and basically we're joining 10,000 ewes and 500 breeding cows on about 3,500 hectares. So my talk today is about using genetics to meet client needs. I will preface it by saying all these thoughts are our own and just an example of the experiences that we've had. So no real data. I'm not saying it's all scientifically correct, but it's what we've seen and how we've gone about running our business. So a couple of key points we've seen is to set breeding objectives, then select sheep with the ASBVs that support that. To get the best result, you need to make sure that your management's meeting the genetics that you're chasing, and number one is still phenotype, no matter how good the data is. So the breeding objectives, I think, when we all put our hands up yesterday that we've heard about bred well, fed well, that's one of the key takeouts from that training. Set your breeding objective, that'll help set the path of where you want to go, and then allow you to assess how you've performed in relation to that as you go through. We're all limited by resources, so when you go and set your breeding objective, it's about how you can get the most out of the resources that you've got available to you, and that's time, feed, management, what you want to run. I think the other big one too is to share your breeding objective with people like your seed stock producer. It's important that they know what you're trying to do so that they can help you achieve those goals. So using ASBVs in our business is about selecting the traits which we feel will give us the biggest economic return. And so we use a cut-off, so we use percentile bands, so we'll see where the rams that we want sit within the industry. Use percentile bands, we have a cut-off and just use Excel, for example, before you get on site to have a look at what those traits are and where they are. Some traits are more heritable than others, and I think that's key for commercial producers to understand so they can see which ones to put more of an economic focus on. When you're spending your hard-earned cash, it's about spending a bit more money on the genetics that'll give you the biggest return. And I think one of the big ones is purchase genetics from someone you can trust. So that's we all make the decision to drive down the driveway of a ram supplier or a seed stock producer. So go to somewhere where you trust their data, the accuracy is good, the integrity is good, and they can show that what they're doing is actually correct. And that's sort of been a big one for us. So this is just a brief overview of what we look for in terms of traits when we're going to select our rams. We look for a balance across these traits, so we don't chase extremes in any one trait. My experience is that can be quite risky. Within traits, there are antagonistic traits and some that I sort of explain as hidden traits, which you just need to be careful about. So one, for example, is people chasing massive post-weaning weights without trying to put a curve on the adult weight, and all you end up doing is having a really big mature weight in your ewes, which then leads to your post-wean or your weaning percentages aren't that great because the mature weight is so high. I think that's one of the reasons we're running into trouble with shearers, because the sheep are just getting too big. So getting a cap and just understanding what traits work together and what traits go against each other is really important. Number of lambs weaned is another interesting trait, which I think a lot of people get caught up chasing and have in the past. Number of lambs weaned is like an index, or was, so it was made up of a number of different sort of individual traits, which were fertility, fecundity, and lamb survival. And you could have a really high number of lambs weaned but get there through the litter size, which didn't necessarily mean that you were getting those lambs through. So it's important to understand how all those traits work together and then tie your management in with that. So the management's key. So I have the old adage there that's 80% in the feeding, 20% in the breeding. Now, whether that is or isn't exactly correct, I think it is a good example of there's no point going out and spending a lot of money on the genetics that you're chasing and then not managing them accordingly. They aren't a silver bullet to get the genetics there and not manage them correctly. And I think that also links with where you buy your seed stock. You know, it's important to look at optimum production rather than maximum production. So just going and buying seed stock from the place that feeds them the best doesn't necessarily mean they are the best genetics and will perform back in your environment. And it's important to keep that in mind when you're going and searching for genetics. Phenotype is still the number one priority for us in our business, both merino, first cross and second cross. So you've got to have the courage to walk past the ram at the auction that has all the figures that you're looking for if he doesn't have the right structure. Structural faults mean that not only will that ram not last and perform for you when you've spent your hard-earned cash on him, the impact across your flock can be large, and that's, you know, you can get bad wool traits or bad structure that goes the whole way through. And that's why it's so important to get on farm and go and look at the seed stock you're buying and actually do the physical assessment. Don't just buy through the figures because they all look fantastic. I just thought I'd use a little example here of how we've used phenotype, genotype and data to move to a non-mules flock. So we decided to cease mulesing 3 years ago now, and that was through a process of, first of all, we started to select rams with a lower EBW breeding value. Tied in with that was making sure that when we looked at them, they actually had a planar breech. Obviously, the rams were only 50% of the breeding, so we visually classed all of our ewes and selected ewes for a planar breech. We then shifted our management. That was about education around better green feed management, putting an extra crutch in there if it was required. And then to get the gain out of that, we then became RWS certified to make sure that we were getting the reward for putting in all of the extra effort on our sheep. So measuring to manage, so I think it's really important that if you set your breeding objective, you then go back and see how you're tracking in terms of achieving that breeding objective. So Ram Select is an amazing tool, which Jim Meckiff was talking a lot about yesterday, so I won't rehash all of that. DNA flock profiling is another amazing tool, and will give you a lot of information on where you actually sit and then allow you to see where you're going to go. Feedback from processes, we've heard a lot from GMP, and this scatter graph is actually some of the lambs that we sent through GMP and got some feedback from, which was amazing for us to see that, you know, with a traditional bell curve, some are really good, some are not so good, there's a lot in the middle, and now we're working with our seed stock producer to work out how we can actually take off the bottom of that bell curve and shift the whole lot forward. Commercial benchmarking, things like the Peter Westblade Memorial Merino Challenge is a fantastic way to see how your sheep are performing against other commercial producers. And I think one of the big ones about that is that we put our sheep in there. I was very nervous about the results. But the feedback from Craig about putting your sheep in is that even if you come last, you've actually come first. You know, if you come last in that, you've actually got the most to learn and the most to gain. So don't be afraid to put your sheep into things like that and see where you can get bigger improvements. And I think just client feedback for us has been key, and then the return businesses. So one of the key results we've seen with our first cross ewe clients are people coming back, and it took us a while to develop this client base. Our IQ crossbreds were a little bit different for New South Wales first cross ewes, and people didn't quite know what they were for a while, and now we have all of our first cross ewes sold before they're even born to repeat clients. And that's through people taking them on, trying them out, getting the results that we're seeing, which is all coming through from the genetics that we're selecting. So The anecdotal and the client feedback is also very important. So, quick summary, that not all sheep with data are good and not all sheep without data are bad, and I'm certainly not saying that, but the genetics help you to select how those progeny are going to breed, and it's just a tool. So the genetics set the potential, but your management is how well those genetics can be expressed. Yeah, as I said, ASBVs are a tool, but they certainly should be used in conjunction with the physical assessment, and obviously sheep are still sheep, so no breeding value for the stupidity. Just before I go, one quick story, and it sort of ties into a lot of the things we've had here today. My staff member went through the training with JM Livestock and GMP, and when Jim from JM Livestock and Jake from JMP came on farm the other day, we're just talking about how the training went and some of the results and the direction that we're breeding for. And I was talking to Jim and Jake about breeding a merino self-replacing flock, breeding my own first cross ewes, and then having a nice even line of second cross lambs to put through the processor. And Jim said to me, "Why do they need to be nice and even?" I said, "Oh, because they're going to look good on the hook chain." He said, "Well, why do they need to look good on the hook chain?" I said, "Because that's what people want." And he said, "No, you want eating quality and you want a high GMQ score, which are made up by lean meat yield and IMF." And it just got me thinking that the challenge going forward is that we don't necessarily have to start breeding from breeds now. We can search lamb plan and chase the sheep, no matter what the breed, with the best genetics we've got in terms of getting a return from GMP, and I think that's a really exciting space. The difficulty that we'll see is that the physical market won't catch up with that, so they'll still want, if you put lambs through the sale yards, to have a nice even line. So I think it's an interesting space that we're going to be playing with in the next couple of years, and it'll be a challenge for the commercial people to get their heads around that, to see the opportunities, but also not going too far one way. So that's it. Thank you.